Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the T.H.O. Movie Reviews podcast, the show where we bring you passionate, honest, and insightful film criticism. I'm your host, Bennett Campbell Ferguson. I'm here at Rose City Coffee Co. Brooklyn Park for part 2 of our podcast about our favorite reboots and remakes of all time. And as before, I'm joined by two of my wonderful colleagues, including Mo Shaunette.
Hello.
And also Patrick Belin.
Hello again.
So, when you guys want to dive in and talk about the next two reboots and or remakes on your list?
I went first the last round, so if you guys want to go first.
Sure, I'll do that. So for these two, again, like I said in part 1, I wanted to do something that was kind of every one of the reboots or remakes that I picked was sort of coming from a different place or trying to accomplish a different aim, or at least led to a different discussion. So for the first two, it was looping back to an original source material and that worked, and trying to bring that to life. For these two, it's looping back to original source material that maybe wasn't great, but that someone believed enough that they could be something bigger. And so the first is not a movie; it's a TV show.
What is this? The Healthy Orange TV movie reviews now? What is this? The sky is falling. I've been waiting to do that.
Okay.
Sorry. Please continue.
And the one I went with is 1997's Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And for me, this is interesting because it's from the same creator. Joss Whedon wrote the screenplay for the 1992 original movie. He felt that the movie didn't do justice. The movie didn't do justice to what he was trying to accomplish with the show. And very stupidly, 20th Century Fox left him with the TV rights when they signed his contract. So he decided to put it on UPN, and it ran for 7 seasons, 144 episodes, and it was...
It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it... Was it UPN? I'm trying to... It might have been the WB originally and not UPN. It was on
But
both
UPN
of them.
doesn't exist anymore, I think.
I know what you're talking about.
I know they combined, but they were 2 different channels, and it was on both.
Yeah.
Right, because then it was... Yeah. Sorry, I'm... Continue.
Yeah, so, but... That it's that idea of it's belief in this idea of high school as hell, of creating this iconic female character, and of trying to just have fun with a fun idea, but also taking it seriously, taking seriously the parts of it that need to be. You know, it's ideal genre fare where it does toe that line between taking itself seriously and taking the idea seriously as metaphor, as just parts of life, but also having fun, having some good action, having some witty banter and clever dialogue. It just works. I say that really flippantly because, you know, TV, any creative medium, especially, takes a lot of different people's hard work, but it's good, and that's one of my favorites. Is a creator giving their own idea another shot and trying to do something better with it, trying to do something more interesting and more under their control.
What's your next pick?
My next pick is a little bit weirder because one can question how much original thought went into it. It's because it is The Jungle Book, 2016's remake of the original version from, I think, 1954. And it is another Disney production, so it would be easy to accuse it of being filmmaking by committee. But the thing about the original Jungle Book, it's not great. I know that one gets a lot of eyes on it because that was the last movie Walt Disney worked on before he died. But really, this speaks to a lot of my fascination with the theme of Disney doing live action remakes of all their movies. Not a lot of the original ones were good, or at least were good by modern standards, and so remaking that, I can see that. I can see them taking another crack at Sleeping Beauty, at The Jungle Book, at the really, really old ones. I don't get that sense with like something like Beauty and the Beast or whatever else they're cooking up, because like the
Dumbo.
Dumbo I can see, but like you can do Dumbo with like less racist crows, like that can happen.
Sure.
And to make sure they did that, they hired Tim Burton, who doesn't know how to hire a minority. But it's just weird to me that like Beauty and the Beast gets a remake. We're getting remakes of
Mulan.
Mulan. At least I can see, because it's like that's Chinese box office is a huge part of
yes.
the filmmaking process.
They're looking for that Chinese cash.
Yeah. And it's an opportunity to get actors who might not get lead roles otherwise into the spotlight. Sort of the same with an Aladdin remake. You can get a lot of Middle Eastern or African actors in there. Granted, I would like to do it without Guy Ritchie directing.
I'd like to do most things without Guy Ritchie, but that's a whole other podcast.
I like Guy Ritchie well enough, just, I don't think he has a very high opinion of women.
I don't think he has a very high opinion of like coherent editing either. If I come on too strong, it's because I still have PTSD from watching King Arthur: Legend of the Sword.
I imagine.
My condolences.
No,
Sorry, continue.
and then, what else? What was it? The Lion King, which phenomenal looking cast. Jon Favreau has proven himself as a director, but why? The first one is really, really good, and people still like it, and it still holds up. So what new spoke are you adding to the wheel? Like with Jungle Book, they were adding like a 3-act structure, like basic film movie stuff. It's not so much a vignette of recycled animation from Robin Hood. So what is there to add with these ones? I don't know. It astounds me.
I have a comment about your selections. I think building on what we were just talking about in the first part in terms of reboots and remakes bringing something new. Well, you're kind of taking that a step further, because your two choices are not just bringing something new, but they're fundamentally crossing over. Whereas in Buffy, it's going from a film to small screen territory, and The Jungle Book is going from an animated film to a live action film. So this is not just bringing something
action.
new. Yeah, live action, but it's a. These are fundamental differences from the previous installment.
And kind of in that vein, something I wanted to ask you about is like kind of like with True Grit, and you were talking about how the Coen brothers version got at some stuff that the John Wayne version couldn't get at, or maybe didn't even try to get at.
Yeah.
And then with Buffy, with Whedon, sticking to his guns and saying, I see something in this that the film didn't see, and like believing he could do more. And same thing with the Jungle Book. You're not the first person I've heard say, hey, that animated film, it's really not all that. I think a lot of people feel that way. So I was wondering, do you think that in a sense that like for a reboot to be necessary, there has to be something in the story that like hasn't yet been realized? Like you can't just like reboot something that's absolutely 100% brilliant. There has to be that little speck of genius that hasn't been gotten to yet.
Well, that's the question. Not necessarily. Going back to what I said earlier, talking to the Planet of the Apes movies, the original 5 movies, there's something to that. There's a reason those movies have held up in the way they have. And we had the 2001 reboot that no one remembers at all. With,
another Tim Burton joint.
Yeah, Marky Mark and the Monkey Bunch.
It would have made more money if they released it under that title.
But it's not necessarily the first one has to be bad, but that you can come at it from a different angle. One of my favorite shows right now, I don't know, and again, we're going into nebulous territory of what is a reboot, is Dear White People on Netflix, which sets itself up as a sequel to the movie and is from the same director. It shares a lot of the same cast. So is it a reboot? I consider it more of a sequel, but it's not. It justifies its own existence because it expands from this original idea. It says we've seen snapshots into the lives of these characters. Let's continue on with it. Let's see how they grow, how they change, how they deal with the changing landscape of American politics. So, for me, it does feel like there needs to be something for a reboot or a remake to justify its existence. There does need to be something brought to the table, even if the original was good. You can still come at it from a different angle. You can bring something new to light, something new to the surface, even if that's just new special effects.
Sure.
I mean, Fury Road, we're going to talk about that later because I've seen you guys' list, and I did, and it's absolutely one of my favorite reboots. But I was trying to vary it up. But it's bringing these old ideas of how to direct action scenes, how to do special effects, how to do social commentary that were in the first few movies, and just blowing them up to huge proportions.
Yeah.
So there is something to that. It's why I'm down on a lot of the Disney remakes, is because it doesn't seem like there's enough new being brought to the table. It's just taking what works and then just doing it again. It's a repetition.
It's like it's just milking the cash cow.
Exactly.
That's why it exists, and that's terrible.
Well, as opposed to like the film Dear White People, which is certainly feels like a complete, fully realized cinematic experience, but because the issues and the story it's tackling is so significant, like there is a little bit of sense of unfinished business at the end. Like there's still a lot they can
haven't
deal
really
with.
solved the problem, and because the problem is racism in America, they are not going to.
Yeah, perfectly put.
So since we talked about Fury Road, perhaps I should go next with my two selections.
Take it away.
Yeah, so my next two choices are Terminator 2, Judgment Day, that was many, many years ago, and Mad Max Fury Road. What I find interesting in talking about these two at the same time is that they're both dystopian sci-fi, which is probably one of my favorite subgenres of movies. So they're both interesting. Let's start with Terminator 2. So the second one was made by the same director or writer that did the first one. And I think, of course, I'm not a part of this generation, but I believe the first one was very much a niche movie, and it has its own fan base.
It was more of like a cult
right,
hit.
Right. It was like a cult hit, whereas Jim Cameron came back and made a sequel, but was also rebooting the property and made it more of this pop culture thing, and popular audiences gravitated towards it, and it became this huge hit at the time.
So do you call it a reboot because it's like it's extrapolating from the first one, which is kind of this sort of down or this sort of compact, like low budget action film, and then turning it into into an epic, basically.
Right. And it's almost as if Cameron, he, now that he had more money and toys to play with, he wanted to take the ideas that he wanted to do with the first one and put them into the second one, and I think he succeeded in doing that. And it's just a fun movie altogether, and I still watch it today. I still enjoy it.
I don't know if I would classify Terminator 2 as a reboot, just as a sequel. It is a direct follow-up in terms of story. It's a change in genre, but it's same director, same writer, same cast, put out in a similar time frame. It's certainly expanding on the ideas from the original, but it's taking it in a new direction, but still fundamentally the same story.
You're probably right on that. It's probably more of a sequel than a reboot, but I just feel like he's he's taking his own ideas and making them more into this like pop culture type of film,
I've been when I saw that's on your list, I was really looking forward to this because I was thinking like it's not something that people traditionally think of as a reboot, and both of you guys raised really interesting points, and I think it just speaks to what we were saying at the beginning. Like Reboot is kind of a broad umbrella that has a lot of wiggle room. But one thing I want to point out is I just think it's so fascinating. The budget of T2 was, I believe, $102 million, which is much more than the first film even made at the box office. And I mean, that doesn't even happen now. Like even Marvel, they would never on a budget outspend the previous film's box office gross.
Well, they haven't had a bomb yet.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, but you get the Avengers making $600 million. Age of Ultron costs $250 million. I think it's really, really kind of a rare and unique, and I'm not sure if it'll ever happen again. Like the idea of a sequel that expands the audience that much, and really set the course for the Terminator films ultimately. Because
you're talking about Marvel. I mean, you could see that with the Captain America movies. You can see that the first one as an old school war movie, the second one as a suspense spy thriller, and then the third one as sort of the Avengers 2.5, basically.
Yes. Yeah.
It's that progression is there's something to that. There's something to this idea of changing genre as it goes. Talk about. I'm trying to think of another example where there was maybe a reboot that took a similar core idea and just changed the genre around. I guess The Thing might be a good example. John Carpenter's The Thing, because the original was just this kind of creature feature, and then they made it much more of a taut suspense thriller. And there's still, the monster and the gore and the practical effects, but it's coming at the same idea from a different angle.
Sure. Or even X-Men First Class, which is taking a franchise that until then had sort of been played in a straightforward dramatic fashion and adding kind of sort of these deliberately cheesy devices split screen and kind of a villain with a submarine and this glammed up troupe of female henchmen, and it's you're taking, but it's still the same themes, it's still the same ideas, but it's kind of positing them into through a more kind of a Tarantino-esque mirror with kind of a bit of edge and irony and nostalgia. But you're
You were also talking about Fury Road.
Oh, Fury Road.
Yeah.
I mean, what more can be said about it? It's such a beautifully well-made film. Of course, it fits the criteria of a reboot pretty obviously. Of course, to sing its praise, to me, it's one of the best screenplays ever made in the last maybe 10 to 15 years. Yes.
Yeah, it should have been nominated for an Oscar.
The filmmaking craft in that is just phenomenal. And going back to what I said about Creed in the first part, it really takes that whole universe and freshens it up and places it in more contemporary terms. When I watch the Mel Gibson movies, they seem very 80s.
No kidding.
Okay, this is like a dystopian future from the point of view of someone who lived in the Ronald Reagan years. Whereas the Fury Road is like a dystopia in more contemporary terms. It's not so much rooted in the 80s dystopianism.
Yeah. Well, to speak to your points, I saw The Road Warrior for the first time at OMSI, and that was pretty cool, seeing it on that giant screen.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was a really exciting experience. But at the same time, there definitely is. It does feel very 80s, and there are moments when it feels kind of choppy or the pacing is off, as opposed to Fury Road, which is just so airtight. And then, if we're going to talk politics, Fury Road this is a film that was, in the works for over a decade, and it came out.
Tell.
Yeah, and it came out, actually before. Before really the the primary before the 2016 election heated up. So I mean, it really looks so prescient in retrospect, to have such a Trumpish villain, right down to the color of the hair, and the ideology, before we knew, had any idea of the kind of hell we were going to be living in today.
You say he's a Trumpish villain. There is so much broad things to dislike about that guy that you can apply it to pretty much any villain and say he's a Trumpish villain. Mm-hmm. Like, everything about him is gross.
Yes. I see.
We're getting real off topic.
I see what you mean, and I do kind of like
I'm not saying I don't disagree. Like there were people like at Comic-Cons cosplaying as Immortan Trump, and it was entirely too fitting. But I do think there is very much this knee-jerk reaction among at least people on our end of the political spectrum to see every piece of media as deliberately anti-Trump, where it's like, if the villain is motivated by greed or ego, or if the heroes are diverse or are racially diverse or female or LGBT, it's very easy to see it in those very stark terms. I think that's something just to keep an eye. That's just an observation. That's just something to keep an eye on.
I want to speak to that because I think that's a really interesting thing. And I half agree and I half disagree. I agree in the sense that I think I have noticed the trend you're describing. People like kind of seeing an anti-Trump perspective in everything.
What they want to see.
Yeah, and and I remember people talking about the wall being built in War for the Planet of the Apes and going like, oh, that's a message. I think and my reaction was like, no, it's just. Not every character that builds a wall is, a metaphor for, Yeah. But I really do think Immortan Joe, and again, this is by coincidence. This is not deliberate because this predates Trump even becoming the nominee. But I do think he's very Trumpish.
It predates him announcing his candidacy.
You're right, yeah. But I do think, it was eerily prescient because
definitely.
Because for one thing, it's like, I mean, yes, a lot of villains have those qualities of greed, megalomania, but not every villain is specifically shown to be a misogynist in the way that Immortan Joe is shown to be. Not every villain, has, I mean, he literally looks like if Trump grew his hair out, and then at the same time, with the badges and the kind of that almost look like advertisements on his breastplate, kind of sort of the gaudy commercialism of the whole Trump empire, and the kind of I think you talked about the grossness, a lot, because you look at Magneto, who is. I mean, he may be, he may be in the class
to him.
Yeah,
I mean,
Magneto has
class.
Brings. Yeah, whereas I think a lot of people would. I even heard some people when I was in high school look at the Joker in The Dark Knight and go it's well, kind of thing along the lines of except for the murdering, he's actually kind of cool, and it's whereas I wouldn't go that far, but it's the Joker has these kind of this trendy vest and these well-tailored pants versus a Immortan
Makes
Joe.
for a great Halloween costume.
Yeah, whereas Immortan Joe, it's he's so awful that you don't even want to look at him, and that's I would say the same of our president.
There's that line that's so good where he goes, "Do not, my friends, become addicted to water.
Yes.
It will take hold of you and you will resent its absence." Addicted to water, addicted to something you need to live.
Yes.
And we're still in the middle of this whole debate about healthcare.
Yeah. I literally saw a political cartoon that said that, do not, my friends, let yourself become addicted to healthcare.
So I get where you're coming from. I do. I mean, there's a comic called Lazarus, where it's our dystopian future. The shitty answer is that it's sci-fi Game of Thrones, but it's more than that. It's a future where countries are divided up by which corporations own the most land there. And the precursor for it was an election wherein a fascist despot won the seat despite his female opponents winning the popular vote. So there's some weird prescience there.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, I saw a play a couple months ago that had the exact same stuff. Although that was written afterwards, so it was reacting more.
And then there's another comic we've got Bitch Planet out, which is just what if the patriarchy wasn't so subtle.
The Kelly Sue DeConnick.
The Kelly Sue DeConnick
right?
series. Kelly Sue DeConnick and Valentine Delandro. But the sort of the straw that broke the camel's back in their series, they haven't put out as many issues because they keep getting delayed. But the implication is that it's the election of a black woman to the presidency is what pushed people enough that they rose up against her and created this dystopia.
Wow.
So, it's... Looking back, it is weird how many different fears have come true, and also that we're living in, like, the dumbest apocalypse.
Well, I mean, I think it speaks to what...
Sounds like a Coen
Way
problem.
off topic. We were talking about remakes.
Well, but it speaks to something I think really important. You said before that, like, kind of really the things we're dealing with now, all these different, new horrors every day. I mean, they're really kind of just amped up versions of, like, kind of all the old problems in a way, I guess.
Yeah.
So, what is your two picks?
Yes, yeah. Okay, so the first one is a very odd kind of reboot. Maybe it's also kind of another sequel boot. It's Superman Returns, and the scene I chose from that is the scene where Superman saves a plane that's out of control and lands it on a baseball field. America. He lands it on a baseball field, and it's just kind of a blatantly, joyously absurd scene. He lands the plane. Everyone in the stands, their reaction isn't like, "Oh man, you spoiled the game." They burst into applause. People across
They intrinsically know that Superman just did a good thing.
Exactly. They across the city, people are watching it on TV. Strangers are like kind of like partying together, like just because of the sight of Superman, and the TV cameras are like training on him as he looks upward very angelically, and I just love that moment because it couldn't be more different from the Man of Steel Superman. Like like the whole idea of Superman Returns was to kind of advocate for the Christopher Reeve era Superman and say why we need kind of this, like, not like a Peter Parker figure who's kind of hated by everyone and saves the day but no one thanks him for him, but we need heroes like Superman who are aspirational and inspire us and fill us with joy and give us something to live up to, and also like kind of in that vein, like there's the complaint like oh, I don't like Superman Returns because Superman never threw a punch. It's like, well, I mean that's kind of what's special about that interpretation. Like he's the kind of guy, like if someone's firing a gun at him, he won't punch the guy. He'll just let the guy fire it at him until he's out of bullets. I mean, it's like he's a very kind of like peaceful, almost diplomatic hero, and that's what makes him special. And but I do want to stick an asterisk next to this movie. It's not a movie I would necessarily recommend anyone watch at this point because it is a Bryan Singer directed film starring Kevin Spacey. So that casts, at the risk of saying the obvious, that casts quite a cloud over it. So I would not blame anyone who felt like they could not watch it again. To be honest, I'm going to continue watching it because it's been a part of my life since I was in high school, and it's meant a lot to me. But it's one of those things. I mean, it means something very different now, and there's no hiding from that. The other film I want to talk about is, surprise, surprise, Fury Road, and the scene I chose from that is the moment when Furiosa wraps the cable around Immortan Joe's head and says, "Remember me," and then rips his jaw off his face. And I saw that movie 4 times in theaters, and without fail, every time that happened, people would applaud. That moment is such a joyous release, and I want to again talk about my experience seeing The Road Warrior on the big screen, because again, while I found it to be very exciting, it wasn't a movie that really revved people up. Like there wasn't energy. There wasn't a lot of energy in the audience, and it wasn't just because it's old. Because I saw Blade Runner at the Empirical as well, the original Blade Runner, and the energy in the room that night was just like crackling.
You get energy from Blade Runner. It's such a slow movie.
But it's a cinematic high. It's so beautiful and poetic. I mean, it's the Road Warrior versus Fury Road. It's things are so desperate and the stakes are so high for a lot of the reasons we just talked about that you really care. Who's about who's going to fall, who's going to triumph, and it means a lot when Furiosa and Max and the wives means a lot when they win, and that's why I think it is. You talked about, Patrick, kind of updating that series for today, and that's I think kind of the best kind of rebooting, because it took something that maybe was a bit worn out and it made it mean something. And honestly, again, I think, as much as Superman Returns, it's aspirational as well. It gives us kind of a hopeful vision of, how, through hard work and sacrifice, you can triumph over, a seemingly invincible, oppressive regime. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
I could see. I get that Superman Returns is a personal favorite film of yours, but and I haven't seen it in a very long time since it was released in theaters. So my memory of it is a little foggy. But if I recollect, to me, my experience was that it was very nostalgic.
It's very nostalgic.
Superman
absolutely.
Returns.
Yeah.
And it
Just
was
this kind of sepia tone, like soft tone look to it.
Right.
This very old school romanticism about Superman. And basically, it's a movie that argues for its own existence, which I thought I was not a huge fan of it when it first came out. In recent years, I've come to appreciate more because I watched Man of Steel and I watched Dawn of Justice, and then I went back and watched Superman Returns. Like, oh, there's like 20 minutes of Superman saving people in a city. That's refreshing.
Yeah. Yeah. As opposed to 40 minutes of Superman just destroying a city.
Yeah, but
So-
it's just, for me, the problem was, and I'm again off topic. It is our way.
It's a reboot,
My issue with Superman Returns is that it comes in a position where a world is so jaded that it doesn't need Superman. It thinks it doesn't need Superman, and that felt wrong to me. It felt wrong that Superman has to argue for his own relevance, especially to Lois Lane, of all people.
You're talking about the plot for Superman Returns.
Yeah.
Okay. I forgot about that.
And that's my issue. Also, apparently Superman's bastard kid is like the centerpiece of it. I think it works. Time has been kinder to it than it is to most films. I would like to see when they do make another Superman movie, and they absolutely will.
Yeah. Maybe with Chris McCoy directing.
Cool. I mean, they've talked to George Miller about directing. That would be amazing. But I would like to see them actually lean into that idea more of Superman as an aspirational figure, as maybe he is at odds with the world. Maybe this old school moralism and optimism is at odds with a much more cynical and, if not necessarily realistic, nihilistic world. There's something to that. I mean, you open your Twitter feed and it's about 8 different people saying different variations on "we're fucked." Maybe the world does need a Superman.
Twitter.
So I think I just convinced myself that movie holds up better. But yeah, I would like to see that. Speaking of future remakes, I would like to see that version of Superman more, the one that they pretend existed in Justice League.
Sure. Yeah. So much bitterness. I think it's because he's gone.
Yeah.
I knew were some interesting points, and I want to speak to both of them. And first, I'll say,
We've had this debate before, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'll say you know Superman much better than I do.
I got a fair idea on Superman.
For those of you who are listening, Mo just pulled up his shirt to reveal his Superman tattoo, which looks badass as always.
Color hasn't faded too much.
So I mean, you're the Superman guy here, so you understand that character much better than I ever will. But I I do want to point out a couple things in reference to what you brought up with the idea of Superman having to justify his own existence. Like, I think I see the same thing as you do, but I see it in a little bit of a different context. Because for me, like, first of all, the plot is that, Superman has left, in the hopes of finding the remnants of Krypton, and the idea is that he left without saying goodbye to Lois. And I always thought that was a brilliant idea, because he doesn't, even if he was raised on Earth, it's not his home, it's not where he was born. And I always thought, that, maybe he didn't, it was a kind of a fascinating idea that maybe he didn't say goodbye because he was afraid, like, what if I don't come back? What if, I find my real home? And so I always liked that, and I also felt that, like, I don't think Lois has any real issue with Superman. I think she feels, personally insulted and betrayed, as she would be, that, he left without, saying anything. And I think, because I feel, if you look at the movie, everyone in the movie is happy to see Superman again, except Lois. The only, the world actually accepts him quite readily, but the one person he really wants to accept him doesn't. And so, yes, people are cheering for him because, and yet there's, this seed of unease, of doubt, with him being sort of unwelcome. And I always thought that, like, that, kind of perfectly summed up Superman's place in pop culture, because, yeah, when, Superman Returns was being made, people were showing up to Comic-Con and cheering, at the panel that Singer did, but then the movie opens and it bombs. And it was very true to the Richard Donner version. It was giving people, something that they had liked before, but people didn't want it. A lot of it was the world had changed. It was the world of Nolan's Batman and Wolverine, of these, and even Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, who I still love, but he was a very dark, violent character. In the first film, he smashes a guy's head through a glass window, and it was kind of like, I felt that the movie was like wrestling with Superman's place in just in the broader scheme of things. And again, like, I think, as you were kind of alluding to, Mo, in a very meta way, and that's the reason I love the idea of his child being a part of the story, because it's like he finds at the end he can't quite fit in as he used to, but what he can do is pass the torch to the next generation, hopefully impart some of his his wisdom forward, and
Okay.
but yeah. Shall we go into the final stretch? Unless anyone wants to expound on my, very lengthy Superman, Supermaning.
Before we get into our top remake, just since we're talking about Superman here, as I was thinking to myself on what makes a good reboot and remake, I kind of went into the territory of what is a terrible reboot. So,
I was trying to put that list together in my head.
What? Let's do that. Let's do least favorite reboots or remakes, because we could, and we'll cut it out if it's too long for time.
So since we're talking about Superman Returns, I unfortunately had to put Man of Steel into my failures of reboots.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I don't mind what they were attempting to do. The way I view it is they were taking the Chris Nolan playbook methodology and what he did with Batman, and they're trying to apply it to Superman. But unfortunately, with Man of Steel, the result was skin deep. It was empty. It was empty. They didn't really do much to it. I think they should have taken elements from Superman Returns and brought that into Man of Steel, but they didn't. It was just like a superficial exercise, and that's why I consider it a failed reboot. But anyways, that's my little tangent since we're talking about Superman.
That's my least favorite one as well. I mean, honestly, watching the last half of the movie, I mean, I have no idea what it's like to be captured and tortured by the CIA, but I imagine watching that final battle, I don't want to say comes close, but is maybe like 0.01% of how awful that would be, because it felt like someone was like hitting me over the head with a sledgehammer, or it felt like I was like the guy in Drive in the elevator, like having my head smashed by Ryan Gosling's foot. I mean, it's like, God, like, I mean, it's just like the non-stop like carnage and destruction with no like story or feeling of coherence behind it. And on top of that, like, you know, there's a scene where all of a sudden some Doc Ock tentacles like appear out of nowhere and are grabbing at Superman, and it's like, where did the tentacles even come from? You know, it's like, come on, man. I could you know, trash Man of Steel forever. But Mo, what's your least favorite reboot?
Oh goodness.
Is it Fan Four Stick?
Fan Four Stick was not ambitious. I will say this again. Fan Four Stick was not ambitious enough to be terrible.
That's a fair point.
Like, it occupies space. It's 100 minutes of nothing, and then you leave, and it's like, okay, let's go get a beer. Let's go do something else. It leaves no impact. It is a pebble being thrown out a window. Like, it's mildly offensive, but there's no lasting damage.
That's a really good metaphor to pebble thrown out the window. By the way, that literally sums up how I felt like after that movie. Like, that was terrible, but you know,
it was a little annoying.
It just made a tiny dent. You know.
Yeah. No. I feel like I don't want to say another comic book movie because that's the easy way to go. But most of the bad movies I see are comic book movies. So I think I might have to say X-Men Apocalypse. I would consider that a reboot.
That was awful.
Because it is a sequel, yes, but it's also setting the stage for like, oh, we're going to bring back the people from the first movie. We're going to bring back Cyclops and Jean Grey and and we're going to go from there. And it was so bad.
I think one of its biggest failures of X-Men Apocalypse is its cinematography. The cinematography in that was just garbage.
It's garbage. The lighting is just ugly. The lighting is, I mean, the lighting is so bad that the lighting on Friends was better. You know,
I would say that the cinematography was amateurish, but I feel like I'm insulting film school students.
Yeah.
Well, and also the cinematographer was Newton Thomas Sigel, who's a great cinematographer. He did Drive, he did Three Kings, he did X2, he did.
I got another good one. Keep going.
But but so I mean, it was so sad to see him turn such shoddy work. Sorry, go ahead.
All right. So we're talking about. You mentioned adaptations that took it from one medium to another. So The Jungle Book was animated and then became quote-unquote live action. Buffy was a movie, then it became a TV show.
Right.
Here's another example of that is a failure, and that would be M. Night Shyamalan's The Last Airbender. And
I still haven't braved that one.
We're nearly 10 years away from it, and it mystifies me that an idea that looked so bad on paper like came up. Like I was at Comic-Con the last year that Avatar: The Last Airbender, the show, the last year it happened. There was a panel with the creators, Brian Konietzko and Michael Dante DiMartino, and they talked about the movie, and there was this general reaction of "oh" from the audience, and they were surprised by that, and it's like, why? This is M. Night Shyamalan post The Village, post Lady in the Water, and you thought
post even The Happening.
No, The Happening hadn't come out yet.
That was 2008.
That was 2008.
The Happening was Last Remember was 2010.
Yeah, but this panel was 2007.
Oh, I got you.
So The Happening hadn't happened yet. But it's like, okay, so first of all, we have seen by this point we'd seen a lot of cartoons get turned into live action movies. They had all been terrible. There was Dragon Ball Evolution, there was Underdog, there were all these old cartoons being turned into live action movies with cutting edge special effects. And none of them were good. And then it's like, well, we're not just gonna take a cartoon show, turn it into a live action movie. We're gonna take a cartoon show, 20 episodes, half hour apiece. That's like 100 minutes. 10 hours. 10 hours of television, and fold that down into a 90-minute movie, and expect it to be coherent. And also, this guy whose name is now a punching bag is gonna direct it and write it and produce it. And it's like, no part of this equation should work. And then they did a lot of whitewashing.
Yeah.
Like the way they explained it is that the girl who plays Katara, she was a producer's nephew or niece or something, and she's gone on to do other acting jobs, and she's not bad. I don't want to harp on her, but she was not right for that role. But she was a white person playing an Inuit, so they cast another white person to play her brother. They had a bunch of Indian actors as the Fire Nation who were supposed to be Japanese in terms of like their style, which feels, I guess, like a lateral move. I'm not upset about that, but it speaks to a certain misunderstanding about what made the series work and what M. Night Shyamalan brought to it. Like, what did he see in this that he decided he wanted to make in a series? And there's a certain amount, I can get it on the sense of there's a certain amount of spiritualism in the show. That's something he's always been drawn to. But in terms of there's also character interaction. There's also well-shot action sequences. There's also deep mythology. There's a lot of things that make that show great that he was not interested in or did not understand. And that was the result, was just 90 minutes of this editing nightmare. It's so bad. It's been 8 years since that movie came out. Everything that's going to be said about it has been said, but it continues to mystify me that someone thought this was a good idea.
Well, moving on to good ideas, do you want to tell us about your final
I don't know if it's a good idea, but it's a weird one.
A selection, and what's your worst reboot?
Oh, it was Man of Steel.
Man of Steel, yeah.
Oh, okay. It was mine too.
So for me, this is something else that fascinates me, but in a good way, and that I have regrettably not indulged myself as much as I would like to, which is another country's remake of American fare, because we see that all the time in this country. We do see remakes of stuff from Japan or from China or from anywhere. I mean, I'm pretty sure every country in the world has their own version of The Office now. But
it's in Japan they remade Sideways.
Did they?
really,
Yeah.
I did not
that's
know
a
that.
choice.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I haven't seen the Japanese version though.
I could see that playing well with Japanese audiences, or whatever.
But we consider American culture so ubiquitous in around the globe, and it's interesting to me at least to see what another country would do with that. So my pick for my last one is one of the few actual remakes of that style that I've seen, which is Sukiyaki Western Django, which is a Takashi Miike production. It's ostensibly it's a hodgepodge of just different spaghetti westerns, but the central plot outline is the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's a drifter and a gunslinger comes to a small town where these two rival criminal factions are fighting for control, and he pledges to protect the people of the town and take down both of these organizations. And it is weird as fuck. It is so much fun in how utterly bizarre it is. One of the factions for starters, none of the actors spoke English, so all of their lines are read phonetically. So they have something of an idea of what they're saying, but not entirely.
Wow.
One of the main bad guys, part of his character trait is that he's obsessed with Western culture, and he hopes to imitate it however he can. So while he's still ostensibly a samurai, most of them are just modeling themselves on samurais, because there's the whole thing of, samurais and cowboys are kind of parallel in terms of how they evolved in terms of cinema. He demands his subjects call him Romeo because he's...
Call him what?
Romeo, because he likes Shakespeare. There's like the Crooked Town sheriff who has multiple personalities and starts Golluming with himself partway through the film. It's so much weirdness, but it's also just so much fun. And I have to imagine not a lot of it is that is a specifically Japanese take on American culture. It's a Takashi Miike take on American culture, which it lends itself to absolute madness. But it's a hell of a time. Also, Quentin Tarantino's in it,
Really?
Yeah, he's like there for like 5 minutes total at the beginning and like near the end, where he's just a guy that's there who establishes his presence just helps establish how weird the whole thing is. Because the first scene is him dressed as a cowboy in front of like the fakest backdrop you've ever seen of the Old West, like telling the story of what's about to happen to these other bandits. At one point, he starts talking in a super fake Japanese accent, which borders on the offensive, but you know, it's a Japanese feature, so I guess I'll allow it.
Sure.
It lives for that level of strangeness and that disconnect. And I feel like if I had done some more research, I would find out that there's some message there that I'm missing. But as it stands, it's just a really strange it's a really strange journey, and it's interesting.
Do you think does it twist the good, the bad, and the ugly a lot? Like,
It's been a while since I saw The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, but it's mostly just using that as a framework.
Sure.
Again, it's one of the characters does turn out to be Django, the character from various spaghetti westerns, played by Franco Nero. It very much just feels like a riff on the genre more than it does a direct remake. So I guess it doesn't qualify, but screw it, I'm here.
Yeah, I don't know. Actually, your selection is pretty interesting, and it just kind of expands on the definition of what a reboot or remake is. In that it's superficially, it's not necessarily has to be an obvious reboot. You know, like it can be like strongly, obviously inspired by like the good and the bad and the ugly, but I think that kind of qualifies it as a reboot and remake, even if it's not so obvious. And it kind of makes me think about my previous comment about Force Awakens. I know I'm like being a little tongue-in-cheek by that, but come on. I mean, this is all like in a lot of ways, Force Awakens was like a remake of A New Hope.
no, absolutely. Yeah.
So I don't know. That I can't help but want to expand my definition of these reboots and remakes in that territory.
Sure.
So I think your top selection kind of justifies that.
Yeah.
I want to see it now. I think it sounds like fun.
It's a lot of
so
fun.
cool.
There's nothing else to say about it. It's so weird. It's so fun.
I just love that picture you painted of like Quentin Tarantino standing in front of a fake backdrop, like, and it's like, and with a Japanese accent, like that sounds so horrible, but it sounds so horrible that I kind of want to hear like, what the heck does that sound like?
Yeah.
Even?
Do you want to go next?
Do you want me to? Do you want to?
Well, I'll go next. So my top selection is probably not that interesting, and it's probably a little predictable if you know me. But mine was Batman Begins. If you were to take, let's just shelve this whole idea of reboots and remakes for a second, and I'll say that for me personally, the movie blew me away when it first came out. It's a movie that exceeded my expectations in so many ways, and who knows? I'm probably just saying that because I'm a Nolan fanboy, but and
aren't we all?
And even more than 10 years later, I still watch it, and it's still a fantastic movie, and I'll watch it over and over again. But if you think about it, in terms of going back to reboots, it was a very ambitious project. I mean, Batman is something that's existed in so many different. It's just been around for so long. You know, there's the Adam West era, there's the Tim Burton era, and so if they're going to reboot this character, I mean, what can they? I mean, what are they going to do with it next? You know, what methodology are they going to go with? Because prior to Batman Begins, my last image of Batman was George Clooney and his bat nipples. You know, I mean, it's a character that Hollywood.
Don't forget the Bat credit card.
Yeah, exactly. You know?
Never leave the
Mr.
cave without it.
Mr. Freeze.
I maintain that Batman and Robin is not as bad as people say. It's bad, no question, but it's not the worst ever. Like, I mean, Batman v Superman exists now, so it's not even the worst Batman movie.
Anyway, sorry.
But anyways, it's just such an ambitious project what they were trying to do, and for them to have pulled it off the way they did is just, for me, it just works on so many levels, and that's why I chose it in my top spot. But anyways, what else can we say about it?
Well, I want to talk briefly about just the idea of authorship with all these movies, because I think it's very interesting. You know, like you have, like before we started recording, I was saying, you know, well, you know, Dunkirk and The Thin Red Line, like those are actually remakes, even though, you know, the original versions aren't talked about that much. But, you know, those are films by directors whose styles are so distinctive that, you know, even though they're treading familiar ground, you know the instant they touch the material, they're going to make it unique. They're going to make it personal. Just, you know, how, you know, when The Beguiled was announced, you know, it was a given that, you know, Sofia Coppola's Beguiled was going to be an entirely different movie than Dawn Siegel's, you know. Fortunately, Sofia Coppola's was also no good, but that's a whole other thing. But, you know, I think it's really interesting. You know, you look at when Batman Begins came out. Christopher Nolan only made 3 films, following Memento and Insomnia. And Batman Begins, even though it's, you know, a continuation of the Batman story, or not in continuity because it's the beginning, but still a continuation of the mythos, if you will. And yet it's it feels like a very like logical continuation of those earlier Nolan films, and even like with the structure of the first act where it's told out of order, you know, well, it kind of feels like Memento, you know, and the kind of very intense relationship that Batman and Ra's al Ghul have, you know, where there's not just a war between them, but real philosophical differences. Well, it's kind of like that with Al Pacino and Robin Williams in Insomnia, or Guy Pearce and Joe Pantoliano in Memento. I think it's fascinating, the idea of like how like kind of one person's like quirks can be like put onto familiar material, and suddenly like it takes on a new vibe or a new meaning, and that just seems like one of the benefits of rebooting. I think. I mean, you know, that you can do that.
Mm-hmm. Is that your? Or no, you already talked about Batman Begins.
You guys ready? You guys ready for my final one? Okay. This is my favorite reboot of all time. I'm going to dispense with my little scene thing for this one because I have to talk about the whole thing because I love it so much. Wind the clock back to May of 2009. I'm about to graduate from high school. I've just done this really exhausting piano exam. I'm getting over a miserable cold. I really need to see a good movie, really bad. And so I decided to go see the first J.J. Abrams Star Trek the weekend it opens. And at this point, I knew nothing about Star Trek. Nothing. I hadn't seen any of the movies, any of the TV shows. I went in completely cold, and my expectations were really high because I've been hearing, how it was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and they were already planning a sequel. But just within minutes of the first scene, I fell absolutely in love with the movie more than I ever could have anticipated. I was crying as I watched Kirk's father sacrifice himself while his son is being born. I still cry as I watch that scene. I think it's one of the best opening scenes in cinematic history, and I just felt absolute joy watching that movie. And kind of like with Fury Road, I got completely wrapped up in it. Like I can still remember seeing for the first time that moment at the end when it seems like all hope is lost, and then one of the Romulans says, "Sir, there's another ship coming in," and then the Enterprise appears out of nowhere and is just like firing phasers and shooting down all these torpedoes, and it's just, I remember just literally like kind of leaping to the edge of my seat at that moment. I was just so like enraptured and overcome by the movie, and more importantly, I fell in love with the movie's take on the Kirk and Spock relationship, and I don't necessarily actually think it was better than how the relationship was portrayed either in the TV show or the previous films, because I kind of liked in the original series and in the original cast movies where it wasn't like they kind of explored who those characters were from childhood. It was really just they were just guys doing their jobs, and they kind of explored their lives through that perspective, and I liked that. I liked the kind of the simplicity of that, but at the same time, I appreciate how Abrams' film tells their story really from birth and Kirk's case, from childhood and Spock's case, and shows how they're both kind of born into trauma. Kirk from the trauma of growing up without a father, Spock from the trauma of being half human and half Vulcan and not really belonging in either world, and how kind of the difference in their upbringings causes them to clash, but they like overcome their differences and work together. And I think it's such a beautiful moment at the end, when Spock walks onto the bridge and says, I want to be your first officer, and Kirk says, "It'd be my honor, Commander," and that still gets me every time, and it's the absolute kind of movie I love. It's filled with bright colors and big emotions. It's incredibly funny. You get just such great slapstick humor, like the whole bit with Kirk's hands just swelling up, which I just think is one of the funniest things I've ever seen. And yet it's not afraid to be sentimental. It's not afraid to be passionate and melodramatic. And it's I've since become a Trekkie. I can speak some Klingon now. Even I've watched all of the Next Generation or most of the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. I've watched all the movies. I'm proud to consider myself a devotee of that lore, but that first film is still really special to me, not because it introduced me to the Trek world, but because it's a great movie. And whenever I hear that Michael Giacchino theme, I get that that old feeling of that day back in May, just experiencing that excitement and those emotions for the first time. So there you have it, Star Trek.
Right on.
Just to go off on what you were saying about the Star Trek, and obviously it was on my list too, and there's a reason why it's on my list, because I've always been on Team Picard. I've always been a Next Generation fanboy, and
he's the best captain.
For the longest time, I've always had trouble watching the original Star Treks because I've always had trouble getting into Captain Kirk and his crew. Mm-hmm. Like, I never really cared for Spock and Kirk. I feel like those characters. What Gene Roddenberry was doing was speaking to that 1960s generation. That 60s counterculture generation. It just didn't really resonate with me, which is why I was more of a Next Generation fan. But I give credit to Abrams. I mean, as much as I'm not an Abrams fan at all, I give him credit for making me care about Kirk and his crew.
Yeah.
I didn't have very high expectations going into Star Trek. Like, I was thinking like, whatever, it's Captain Kirk. But when I came out of it caring about Captain Kirk and his crew. And so what Abrams did with those characters and leaving me with that impression is one reason why I left it on. It's on my top 5 list on Reboots.
I think you make a good point, and I think it's just your investment is different. Like when you've seen Kirk in this really vulnerable place, when you see him getting beaten up by like a whole group of people in a bar, and kind of sitting with napkins hanging out of his nose, looking so pathetic and having given up, and Pike saying to him, your father was captain of the starship for however many minutes, he saved all his lives, including your mother's and yours. I dare you to do better, and kind of when you see like his life, from that perspective, as opposed to the perspective of like it's Bill Shatner, sitting in his chair, saying his Shatner things. I mean, it's like your investment is very different. And I love Shatner, I love Nimoy, but it's I do think there was a greater emotional impact.
I think one of my problems also is I felt like Shatner's depiction of Kirk is just way too two-dimensional.
He was what he was for the time.
Sure.
I'm sorry. I'm tired. I'm being. This conversation's worn me down.
No, fine.
Original Star Trek. It's very much a morality play. It's very much a product of its time.
Yes.
For the 60s liberal view of a utopian future. And so you have someone like Kirk who represents this old school machismo of strength and intelligence, but he also has a sense of compassion, of wisdom. He's willing to listen to people from different backgrounds. He's willing to listen to people who are aliens, or they're women, or they're people of color, because he understands that they all need to work together to create the better future. And so he was very much an archetype. I won't deny that. For me, with the Star Trek reboots, I like them. I wish I liked them more. The first one is the first one, the 2009 one, the Star Trek We Don't Have a Subtitle one.
Which I love that they could do that, because the first film was called Star Trek: The Motion Picture. So it was like it was kind of the most like out of left field but obvious idea in the world. Like, why not just call it Star Trek? They've actually never done that. But sorry, continue.
But for me, it's a popcorn feature, and that's fine. There's fun to that, but again, Star Trek had that philosophical and sort of a little more intellectual bent to it. It didn't always get it right, and it wasn't always subtle, but that was there. And so for the first one, for me, I liked it at the time. I still like it as a popcorn movie, but more than anything else, it feels like brand management. It feels like we need to put the pieces in the right place so we can do better Star Trek movies down the line. We need to get the Enterprise, we need to get the crew, we need to have them say the things, so, damn it, Jim, I'm a doctor, not a whatever, or do the Vulcan nerve pinch, or this or that, the other thing, and we have to bring in Nimoy so we can be like, oh no, the other stuff still happened, this is just kind of different. And I am hard pressed to think of any movie that would be worse off for the inclusion of Leonard Nimoy.
Well said.
God rest his soul. But then we get Star Trek Into Darkness, and that was not a good movie. Like I know we've had this discussion before, and I've said this before, but it doesn't work for me, and a big reason is because it's operating under that same logic of, well, the second movie was The Wrath of Khan, let's do The Wrath of Khan again, but let's not include any backstory, and let's make Khan, like, completely whatever the fuck, and then let's do direct callbacks to Wrath of Khan, but that's a dumb idea, because if you're gonna measure yourself against another Star Trek movie, don't make it the one that everybody loves. And then we had Beyond, and Beyond seems a step in the right direction, but I don't know how many more they have in them, especially with the tragic passing of Anton Yelchin, and with Discovery becoming a thing on TV. We have the Orville, which seems like one of the better Star Trek series, even though it's not a Star Trek series, and it's made by Seth MacFarlane made one of the best. How is that? Okay. But as far as as time passes, more and more, it feels like 2009 Star Trek was unfulfilled promise. I don't want to crap on it because it's a fun movie. It's just I wish I liked it more, and I wish I liked this whole experiment more than I do.
It's and I think that you bring up a lot of interesting things, and first of all, I'll just say, even though I still enjoy a lot of things about Into Darkness, over the years I have to admit I've come around more to your perspective, because it's like when you start, just certain things become so annoying at a certain point, Kirk coming back to life with the quote unquote super blood. Yeah, some of that stuff. It's just like I feel like both Into Darkness and Beyond are both kind of a missed opportunity, because like Into Darkness had it had the visual beauty but without a good story, and Beyond was the story was a little tighter, but it just the imagery and the filmmaking was just so like kind of uninspired and.
Yeah, I'm not going to say that Beyond is without flaws. It definitely is, but it's for me it felt like a step in the right direction because it was actually about this philosophy of Star Trek, of like this utopian future and what does that mean.
I hear you, yeah, and that's a fair point, I think, you know. But I would say I do have to say I really feel that the first one is more than a popcorn movie and more than brand management because you know, kind of like what you were talking about, like we have to have him, you know, say you have to have Bones say, you know, I'm a doctor, not a blah blah blah. You have to have the Vulcan nerve pitch, you know. I guess for me, like I get so caught up in the emotional journey of the characters. Every time I watch it, I never think about that stuff. You know, it doesn't feel like it's hitting notes because I mean, I feel like you know it's about these two guys growing up. It's about them, you know, going from you know they don't know what their place in the universe is to you know kind of having this sense of purpose at the end and kind of becoming who they're meant to be and kind of in terms of that, like I'll be the first to admit, you know, like I do. It is kind of a simple story, and it cribs from not only Star Trek but also Star Wars. You know, again, planet-destroying superweapon, and you know, I do think it would be a better film if it didn't play those beats so much. I mean, my favorite Star Trek show is Deep Space Nine, and you know, it's one of the most ambitious TV shows ever in terms of political allegories. And I mean, I would love to see, you know, Abrams direct a Star Trek script like that and bring his intensity and his storytelling to something that had that heft. But at the same time, I do think that the 2009 film has more weight and emotional and thematic richness than it's given credit for. You know, when you see, you know, a scene like where, you know, Spock is, you know, being educated in his little weird Vulcan pod thing, and then, you know, he's clearly like the most scholarly kid of the bunch, the smartest one, yet you have these other Vulcans coming up to him and saying, you know, you have no place in this universe, you know, look at his human eyes, they look sad, don't they? And them pushing him until the human side comes out. I mean,
the world's most logical bullies.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's I think there's real weight to that, and I think there's real weight to Kirk's journey as well. Like this guy who is such a schmuck, and you know, really such an asshole and a jerk, and you know, and such a slacker, and yet he has it in him to be a great leader. He just, you know, has to find the tools how, and I just, you know, I love it, you know, kind of the movie's understanding of human nature, like, you know, the, you know, quote unquote sexy guy is the one who gets to be captain, and you know, the guy Spock, who outwardly has all the qualities to be captain, he's the one who gets the girl. You know, I mean, it's like kind of just this understanding of sort of the perversities and the, you know, the kind of just how human nature is never quite what you expected, and I think that's something from Roddenberry that Abrams carried on, and you know, he's not a visionary like Roddenberry, but you know, also I think the fact that he wasn't like a Star Trek guy kind of, you know, made him like a great choice for the movie, because there's always the, you know, I've heard the argument sometimes that, you know, Abrams is better suited toward Star Wars, but I don't agree with that, because I feel like you know, what makes great art is at least in some cases friction, you know. And you know, when I see Abrams, you know, because it's like the idea of taking the intellectual content of Roddenberry and combining that with the energy and like kinetic visuals of Abrams, to me that makes a really potent cocktail, because it's exciting on a visceral level, but it has that emotion, it has that complexity. Whereas, you know, Abrams, you know, doing Star Wars, to me that's like, oh, you know, that's like Abrams times Abrams, or Star Wars times Star Wars. There's no friction because he is a Star Wars guy, you know. I mean, George Lucas himself, part of the reason Star Wars was great was there was friction there, because that was not his kind of movie. The kind of movie he liked to do was more like THX, and the kind of the friction of that guy like forcing himself to do something he wouldn't necessarily normally do, but was very good at, you know. But that's, you know, I mean, that's getting into a whole another thing. Before we wrap up, do you guys have any more thoughts about reboots, remakes, or the like? Or Star Trek, if
I
you so
think,
desire.
I think we rightly spent a lot more time talking about reboots because they're more interesting than remakes. But in terms of remakes, I think one thing we didn't really talk about is this regional crossover thing that we see. Like we didn't really get into the type of remake where. What is that? The girl with the dragon tattoo, where it was originally Swedish and then it was remade for American audiences.
Yeah,
and
that
then
whole
there's
thing,
there's Let the White One In, that was also originally Swedish, and then it was made into an American version. Stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that's a type of remake that it's kind of interesting sometimes. But I think
it is if they do it right.
Yeah.
I mean, they're one of the ones I'll talk about. I'll talk about Death Note, which came out on Netflix last year, which was a remake of a very popular Japanese manga and anime series, and it feels like there's something that gets lost in translation because they Americanize it for local audiences. So with the main difference is sort of the background and the characters. In the Japanese version, the idea is that the main character gets drawn into this world of mass murder, essentially, because he already has something of a god complex to him. He's this star student. He's a great athlete. He's a brilliant student. He's very popular in high school, but he's bored. And so when the power to kill people anonymously falls into his lap, he takes it wholeheartedly. Meanwhile, you move it to America, the kid, he basically is a school shooter in the making already. Like he's just this. He's still very smart, but he's picked on all the time. He's an outsider. He's just this kind of awkward kid, and so it's similar. He takes to murder quickly, but it feels like less of a shocking contrast. And he's just not as compelling as a character. Granted, I really don't like Yagami as a character, so making him into such a douchebag is good for me. Works for me, but there's something to that idea of adding or subtracting or changing culturally specific things that makes a story so much more potent. I don't know if I mean, well, I'll go back to Black Panther. Black Panther is very much tied into this African American experience of not only creating. It's about creating this idealized version of an African nation for a group. For many, they don't necessarily have a connection to that culture, to any African culture. And so you create Wakanda where it is everything you would want. It's technologically advanced. They do treat all genders equally. And presumably I have to imagine there's gay liberation in Wakanda, because I think some of the characters were written as gay, but they didn't make that jump onto the screen. Or it was cut for timing or something like that. So that definitely, for countries that are post-colonial, post-slavery, that would mean a lot. I don't think you could have like the same sort of thing in in like China or something like that. Maybe with China. And then you've got talking about Mad Max. It's like the first one is very much about these anxieties of Australia at the time, and so that just speaks to the larger idea of how culture informs art, and what gets lost in translation if you try to take another culture and import it to America or anywhere else, really.
Sure. I think that's such a brilliant point and a good reminder, like how much the context matters, because it's kind of interesting, when you're talking about like sukiyaki Western Django, and maybe something was gained by taking that into another culture, whereas Death Note, the opposite's happening, because by putting it in America, you're taking away what made it special. It's kind of interesting how those things things both work in concert. I mean, you know.
Yeah. I'm also very tired, so I'm getting super rambly right now.
That's okay. That's what this whole thing is here for.
Yeah.
This has been a pretty, I would say, a heavy lifting exercise.
Yeah.
Into reboots.
It has been edifying.
You guys have any final thoughts? Are you ready to reboot out of here?
I'm not opposed to the idea of reboots and remakes. I just, I'd like to see them justify their own existence. I do like to see them bring something new to the table, put another spoke in the wheel.
As opposed to just clearly milking the nostalgia cow.
Yeah. It's like so many of them, it seems like they exist off of this filmmaking by risk management, where it's like,
Yes.
okay, so this name meant something in the past, therefore it's possible it'll mean something right now. And that's all the thought that they put into something getting greenlit.
You just described all of Hollywood's like philosophical approach to movie making these days.
Because it's become such a bloated thing. No one wants to everyone wants to minimize risk as much as possible.
Yeah.
And it's that, a lot of times it is that risk that makes something memorable. That makes something that stands the test of time, becomes something that people love. But that's speaking to a larger idea of filmmaking and whatnot.
I got nothing to add to that. That sums it up really well.
I'm good. I don't know. Watch some movies, have some fun.
Here, here.
Everything's going crazy right now. You deserve to take care of yourself.
Well, I think that about wraps it up. If you like this podcast, please click thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to like us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter if you'd like, at T.H.O Movie Reviews. And please check out all the great reviews and content we have at thomoviereviews.wordpress.com. Once again, I'm your host, Bennett Campbell Ferguson. I'm here with Patrick Belin. I'm here with Mo Shaunette.
Yep.
And from all of us here at T.H.O Movie Reviews, happy movie watching.
Ciao.
Bye.